The United Nations General Assembly has just voted on a draft resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and for parties to the conflict to fully comply with their obligations under international law. Let's speak to our U.S. correspondent then, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, on the back of the UN Assembly vote to unpack for us what just happened. Well, good day to you, Sherwin. Please give us the latest from the UN. Of course, we note that Palestine was only given observing rights, one would say, for obvious reasons, but were indeed allowed to give their submissions. Perhaps you can talk to us about what the Palestine's foreign minister indeed had to say.
Well, let's perhaps just start with a vote that's just hot off the press flow. Yeah. The UN General Assembly has just voted on that draft resolution. Let me tell you what the resolution says. It demands an immediate ceasefire and for the parties to comply with their international law obligations. It demands immediate, unhindered provision of essential goods and services to civilians in Gaza, humanitarian access, the rescission of the evacuation order that Palestinians move from the north of Gaza to the south, and the release of all civilians on both sides of this conflict. Essentially, that's what the resolution says. I can tell you now that it has just been adopted by the UN General Assembly. 120 countries in favor, including South Africa, 45 abstentions, 14 no votes. The text required 2/3 of UN member states present and voting. It exceeded the 2/3 threshold, 120 in favor. So the General Assembly succeeding here where the UN Security Council has failed on 4 attempts to pass resolutions that deal with humanitarian access into Gaza. The Security Council unable to reach consensus. Some vetoes were deployed, a lack of consensus among the P5. The UN General Assembly has a lower threshold, no vetoes in the General Assembly, and so they've sent this moral message, what the temperature of the world, as it were, aflow.
Yeah.
It might not necessarily immediately change things on the ground. UN resolutions, UN General Assembly resolutions are not legally binding, but it certainly tells you where countries stand on this issue, and the majority of UN member states are saying they want a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza now. They want humanitarian aid into Gaza right away. As the Secretary General continues to call for a humanitarian ceasefire, given the deteriorating humanitarian situation on the ground, particularly now as we're getting reports of a severe bombardment being undertaken by the Israeli Air Force and possible the beginning of a ground offensive here as Gaza remains in a complete blackout. The only light in Gaza tonight, Flo, are the explosions from those airstrikes.
Interestingly, you talk about, the vote unlikely to have a real impact on the ground, but clarity on where UN members stand, on the conflict. Why is it important for us, to know, who stands where and why?
Well, it gives you a sense of what countries believe needs to happen here. It shows you where your allies are, depending on which side of the equation you fall, and it shows you where your detractors are. And look, if a vast majority of countries are saying, hey, we do not believe that what's happening there is correct, it sends a moral message. The unfortunate thing is that the United Nations is an unreformed institution for the last 75 plus years, right? Yeah. This is an institution that came out of the ashes of World War II. And so the structure here has to favor the victors of World War II in the 1940s. And so you're applying the rules that were adopted then to a situation and a conflict that is happening in 2023. So it's really, really important to understand where countries fall in an equation where people kind of look at the United Nations and paint it with one brush, right? The United Nations is either this way or it's that way. What this vote does, it shows you exactly where countries stand. When it comes to the pressing matter of which side of a conflict they will defer to, it really does give us guidance on what a country is saying. Like we saw with South Africa when it came to their abstention during the Ukraine vote in March last year. That became a big news story because we really got an understanding of where South Africa was falling in terms of that conflict, espousing a neutral point of view. And so it informs citizens of what their countries believe needs to happen here now.
All right. And just going back to my earlier question regarding Palestine and the fact that, of course, they were only given observing rights. And as I said, some might say for obvious reasons. But indeed, there was a representative who did give submissions, Palestine's foreign minister. What came out of that and what sort of submissions were given there?
Look, Palestine has observer status at the United Nations. They're not a fully fledged member state because that is a negotiation that is, has been delayed now for decades. We haven't seen direct negotiations between Israel and Palestine. And the word from UN member states, from bodies like the Security Council in particular, is that there's no substitute for those direct negotiations. And for Palestine to become a state, those negotiations need to happen. But the Palestinians were the first to speak in this General Assembly debate that is now continuing, that led to the vote that we just saw, and you saw a real appeal from the Palestinian envoy. It wasn't the foreign minister who spoke in the General Assembly, it was their UN ambassador, Dr. Riyad Mansour, and he basically begged member states to support the resolution that was introduced by Jordan. And I'll tell you why. A statement from the Secretary General Flo just a short time ago says the humanitarian system in Gaza is facing total collapse, with unimaginable consequences for more than 2 million civilians. Bombing is intensifying. The needs are growing more critical and colossal. They're not getting enough trucks through. Apparently only 12 trucks are getting there on average through the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. Only 12 trucks are getting through a day. The UN says before October 7th, the October 7th attack, almost 500 trucks were going into Gaza every day. Remember, Gaza was facing a humanitarian emergency before the Hamas attacks and before the bombardment by Israel started. The Secretary General says the verification system of the movement of those goods needs to be improved so that you can get the capacity required to meet the scale of the disaster that Gazans and Palestinians are facing right now. And he ends with this flow: misery is growing by the minute. Without a fundamental change, the people of Gaza will face an unprecedented avalanche of human suffering. Everyone must assume their responsibilities. This is a moment of truth. History is judging us all, and I think members of the General Assembly, certainly the ones that voted in favor of this resolution, will say that we have met this moment. History can judge us because we've passed the resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire. The question, though, is whether it will be implemented, and I can tell you, probably not.